Hello Blazers, happy 420. It's Sebastian from the Rhythm section, and today, to kill some time until Playboy Carti drops a whole lot of red, I'm going to be reviewing the new Fiona Apple album, Fetch the Bolt Cutters. Fiona Apple is an angsty singer-songwriter and piano rocker who's been singing about heartaches and heartbreaks over 4 different decades now, starting off in the 90s with albums like When the Pawn, when she began to establish her signature style of kind of heartbroken and bittersweet piano and jazz pop. Last decade, in 2012, she dropped her acclaimed album The Idler Wheel, which saw her writing about lots of familiar topics for the most part, but she had begun branching off into some significantly more diversified instrumental palettes, which brought her a lot of comparisons to fellow singer-songwriters like Tom Waits. And she's continued further down this path of progressively getting weirder and weirder instrumentals on this newest album, which she announced about a month ago with a short clip of her dog running along the beach. So about now is where I would throw in a joke to transition, like I've been doing at the beginning of some of my other reviews, and I considered doing some sort of pun about like her last name, but I figured it was probably too low-hanging fruit. Okay, real talk, how do I feel about the album? I think this is a pretty excellent singer-songwriter album, full of lots of diverse instrumentation, kooky production, some really passionate and impressive performances, and also some mature yet still very rebellious lyrics about relationships as well as femininity and individuality. And be it boyfriends or the music industry, I think individuality and not caring what other people think is a pretty major theme throughout the entire album. I think everyone's heard from family, friends, guidance counselors at some point to not care what people think at some point when other people have been bringing you down. But it feels like on this album, Fiona Apple is kind of finally reaching a point where she's really just acting from her own perspective and cutting out the haters. This progression in Apple's character is first introduced on the very first track here, I Want You to Love Me, which features some individualistic, highly self-contented lyrics. And just to clarify, when I say individualistic, I don't mean that Apple comes across as selfish ever, just that it feels on tracks like this like she's more content with who she is and not having to rely on her partners or other people anymore. This exact sentiment is expressed really eloquently through lines like, I know a sound is still a sound around no one. And she does seem to be really desirous on the song for love. She definitely wants a partner, but it doesn't feel like she's holding on to the idea that she needs a partner on the song anymore when she says lines like, whenever you want to begin, begin. Which I think is a really great way to express this new epiphany that she's had on this album through a sort of romantic lens, especially with the really nice transition from the fluttering piano runs in the first half of the track to the sort of more upbeat waltzy section in the second half. And Apple teases even more at these same themes on the next track, Shamika, which is a pretty upbeat piano rock track and is probably one of the most narrative tracks on the entire album. It features catchy as well as very theatrical piano licks that complement her kind of sassy and unconcerned lyrics really nicely. And then track 3 here, Fetch the Bolt Cutters, the title track, is where it first feels like she's explicitly expressing this new turning point that she's had in her life towards self-contentment. On the track, Apple artfully rejects her past attempts to try and change herself for people, and she's specified in interviews and discussion about the song that she's talking specifically about her attempts to create a public persona in the music industry. And to go back to her dog that I mentioned that was included in the teaser for this album, the sound clip of the dog near the end of the title track I think has a bit of symbolism with sort of like a free reigning beast or breaking free in some way, not to mention that it's on the cover of the album as well. And the track has some jazzy bell chords, some kind of busy production that sounds almost like found percussion, like Household Items or something, as well as some pretty prominent bass. And you'll start to hear on this song, as well as multiple songs on the album, a kind of claustrophobic, compressed mix, which was a complaint that I read about the album from multiple sources. But to me, it definitely feels very intentional, especially on tracks like the title track. If you listen close to the mix, I don't think the compression is ever really resulting in anything sounding muddy. Instead of muddiness, I think it creates like a kind of interesting claustrophobic, at-home, sort of homey jazz band sound. And I would say that track 4 has some pretty direct evidence that the compression is definitely done here on purpose. Around 2.5 minutes into Under the Table, there's a reprise of the phrase that opens up this song that is very compressed. There's the compressed bass under it, and the compression is definitely used here deliberately to create a really intense and more dramatic sound from the bass and vocals. The song Under the Table also goes through several key changes, as well as has a few sections that feel like kind of wonky modifications of the traditional verse and chorus pop song structure. And I'd say that most of the tracks on this album follow some sort of song structure like this. It seems generally like a verse and chorus type pop structure on most of the songs, but there are lots of interesting bridges and kind of winding passages that keep it from feeling too formulaic on any of the songs here. However, in Under the Table's lyrics, Apple also puts herself into a pretty tough position, because along with her new individualistic worldview, she's also proclaiming proudly on this song how she won't shut up. So past song 4, Apple sets herself up in a position where you're listening pretty close to the following few songs to see what it is she's saying that's so uncensored. And later in the album, while she does dive into topics like manipulative relationships and gender inequality, I think the song that immediately follows Under the Table, Relay, isn't a super satisfying follow-up. It's not a bad track, I think it's more meh to me, but I think Relay's spiritual, kind of mantra-like repeated chorus is just a little too surface level and too repetitive to really justify how long the song runs. And the song also peters out with not much happening for about a minute longer than I think it really needed to. And while we're listening Lowlights, I think the second to last track here, Drum Set, is kind of standard for the sound as well as lyrical themes that happen throughout the album. Like Relay, it's definitely not a weak track, but it's not as good as some of the highlights on here. I also think the closer, On I Go, isn't really going to land for everyone because it is kind of repetitive, but I think its eerie atmosphere and lack of bombast fit the realism of emotion that Apple is presenting throughout the album, and I think the little nugget of wisdom that her mantra on this song presents of trying to live life in the moment is pretty admirable. But I think that's where I really draw the line for Lowlights here. Right after Relay, we get a tough 1-2 punch of Vitriol, Rack of His, and then the immediately follow-up super dark track, Newspaper. The former narrates a relationship troubled by some unequal effort from the two people involved over a really catchy riff that's played by a flute and a piano. And Newspaper, as I said before, is probably the darkest track on the album. It has some really compressed drums that feel just ready to explode. Another usage of the compression on this album that I think exemplifies that it's probably pretty deliberate here. And on the track, Apple is talking about the frustration of seeing her ex get with a new girlfriend and the sort of manipulation that she feels is happening in order for her to feel like she's missing out on the guy. Another track with this very blunt lyrical style that some people may be more drawn to than others is the track For Her. This is a super impactful track that's based mostly around some strong vocal melodies and harmonizing, and it's mostly about abuse of power, social position, and rape. However, after the two vitriolic and really punchy, blunt tracks that I mentioned earlier, she does get into some more subtle and kind of poetic songs as well. And the edgy, angsty tracks are definitely poetic too. But in contrast, Ladies is a more stripped back waltz about systematic gender inequality. And I really love her vocal performance on this song. I think the low-pitched, sort of quivering vocals that she has near the end of the song are probably one of my favorite parts on the entire album. And the amazing vocal performances continue on the song Heavy Balloon, where Apple totally lets loose on the chorus. The explosive chorus is in line with the metaphor here that Apple is making between heavy balloon and depression. It's like a huge encumbering weight that she feels, but at the same time, it's like she can just pop at any moment. And I think all these songs really skillfully present some complex topics that definitely outweigh the slightly more half-baked tracks on here like Relay. On Fetch the Bolt Cutters, Fiona Apple delivers a sound that has a lot of character to it, even if it's not like super groundbreaking. And I think her reflections on womanhood, manipulation, and individualism, ranging between blunt and very densely poetic, never lose the fact that they're all very emotionally complex. I think your enjoyment of this album is going to fluctuate a lot based on how much you can tolerate the really artsy sort of theater kid vibe that Fiona Apple gives off sometimes. And I think it's also going to depend a lot on whether you like the compressed style that the production has on lots of the tracks here. But I really like the album, and I'd rate it at like a 9 out of 10. And if you also rate it at like a 9 out of 10, if you like this album a lot, then you should give this one a shot. If you haven't heard it, Horses by Patti Smith is a total classic album. It's got lots of piano rocky elements, just like Fiona Apple's music, but it definitely is a lot bluesier. It's got the same feminism and consistently poetic lyrics that Fiona Apple brings throughout most of this album, though. And it doesn't hurt that Fiona Apple literally shouted out the first song on Horses on the song Shamika on Fetch the Bolt Cutters too. So yeah, if you haven't heard this album, it's a classic. I think if you enjoy Fiona Apple's music, there's no way that you won't like it. So check it out. And stay tuned and check out my next few videos too. So I'll see you later. Bye bye!